bonjour tout le monde. Hello again. We're break, and I did enjoy reading your beaver-related story. Oh, I gave it away. Yes, it was a beaver, le castor, castor. And someone here pointed out it all affects us all the time. It's on our money, after all. A very small denomination, but still, the proud beaver. Always welcome in our coffers, I guess. Mais c'est ça. Break time is over. Most of our panelists are ready to go. We've got one more session, panel discussion this afternoon, which is youth and innovation in heritage. Now, I'm just having a look. Youth, we're all there. Are we ready to get going, pretty much? Yeah? All right. Well, let me introduce our moderator, which is Matthew Komus. Matthew Komus has developed programs and exhibits for many different museums and heritage sites in Manitoba. Topics covered included everything from hockey and haunted buildings, which were very popular, to modernist architecture and composting toilets, not as popular. In addition to working as a museum consultant, he runs his own tour company and has published 2 books on local ghost stories. He was very flattered to still be considered for a panel with youth in the title, and I did not write this. I assume, Matthew, you wrote it yourself. Genius. So I'm going to pass it on to Matthew. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much for having me today. I'm quite sort of proud or happy to host this panel, because I think it's a really important topic. And I was joking a little bit about being glad to be asked for something with youth in the title, but I won't name the organization, but it wasn't too long ago I attended a meeting with a number of individuals, a lunch meeting, and everyone at that particular meeting, except for myself, paid the seniors discount at the restaurant. So heritage is definitely something that has a challenge with attracting youth, and does tend to maybe skew a little bit older than some fields. And I think for a very long time we've been told about this sort of wave of retirements coming, and I think it is slowly starting to happen. A lot of the boomers are starting to leave. There's been some major changes in some of our heritage institutions in Manitoba. Some very long-lasting people have retired. But there's also going to be a really big challenge for young people going into the field, because we're so often seeing sometimes cuts, and positions as someone retires are not always filled. Government departments that maybe were 20 people are now 10, or museums that might have 3 or 4 people working in one area now have 1 person. So even though some of the jobs are opening up, these cuts are certainly going to have an impact. And I also know, I'd say, out of the young people working in the field, probably half are wearing multiple hats. They're not just the curator at one museum or one institution, but they have one job, they have the part-time job, they have the side gigs they take on, and that seems to be really becoming quite a thing. And I think that has advantages and disadvantages. And the last thing I'll mention before I turn it over to our panel is, for those of you who are maybe trying to attract youth into your organization, whether that's through staff, through volunteers, through board members, it's being open to change. That can be a really big challenge, but I think that's something you really have to keep in mind. If you're going to attract young people, they're not just going to maybe want to do the way that you've been doing things. So you really need to be open for some of those changes, and letting kind of new ideas in. And that can be definitely a challenge for sure. So with that, we're going to start off today's panel with Jenna Emslie. She's a recent graduate from Carleton University's Public History's Master Program. She also has a Bachelor of English Literature from Brandon University. She specializes in how video games can be a powerful means of educating players and fostering interest in public history. And she approaches it from a multidisciplinary perspective, combining her experience with literature and storytelling with history methodologies. So please take it away, Jenna.
Thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to be using a presentation, since video games are very much a visual medium. One sec. All right, so video games in history is a very large topic. There's a lot of ways to sort of dive into it, but being that video games in heritage projects are very small at the moment. I'm just going to use this as sort of like an introduction to the topic to try to get people interested in it and think about video games as a viable way to approach the field in a new way. So history of video games and putting participatory public history into practice is what I'm talking about. So broad, yeah. So here, sorry, a little bit nervous. I haven't done a panel discussion before. Okay, so I'm sure some folks will have heard of like video games. There's some very large ones out there. So when someone says history video games, there might be a few different ones that come to mind. It might be some of the more recent large projects like Red Dead Redemption 2. It's a game that cost like over $450 million to make, and it raked in almost $1 billion its opening week. So video games are a very lucrative industry. So this one you might have heard of, or the Assassin's Creed series, or more simulation games like Civilization, or the OG classic Oregon Trail. That one I'm sure a lot of us have played as kids, and when we think of history games, these ones might be the first ones that come to mind. So, Jeremiah McCall, a gaming public historian who focuses on gaming, he said that more than any other medium, video games invite the public to play with the past, to enter virtual historical problem spaces, and solve problems reflective of those faced by actors in the past. And this is where, to me, like a great deal of value comes from video games, even if they aren't accurate. In terms of history, games that use history as their stage give us a unique opportunity to engage in history in ways that aren't available in textbooks, museums, nonfiction literature, or documentaries. And I find it's very underutilized at the moment. There's more literature and academia being published now analyzing games, but in terms of games being produced or talked about or utilized in heritage spaces, that's very underutilized at the moment. So I'll briefly touch on historical accuracy. So when we talk about games or documentaries or even historical fiction, that's something that people usually try to bring up is, well, that's not very accurate. Well, yes, Assassins versus the Templar Order is not very accurate, but it makes for good storytelling. So this was said by a game designer for a strategy history game. Why do we use caricature of history? Because caricature is easier to manipulate than raw history. So that's kind of the approach that people who are looking to make a profit off of history games tend to take, and that's where some of the criticism lies in terms of using history as sort of costuming rather than trying to engage critically with it. But I think that's a short-sighted view of interpreting historical games. So gaming scholar Lisa Gilbert found that students who played the game Assassin's Creed had a willingness to allow games to rewrite their beliefs about history and theorize about the game's historical accuracy, even though they might have missed opportunities for critical engagement with its visceral sense of immersive experience. And similarly, Jeremiah McCall stated that authentic and rigorous historical arguments between players are generated by the game's mechanics. So, which is more important, the historical accuracy in the game itself, or the unique opportunity to create connections with players and to provide a medium through which they can investigate the history presented critically? And so I think that through games, you can analyze history in ways that you can't, or in video games, especially since you're participating in it, you're immersed in it, you're vicariously experiencing what's being presented. And those representations can't necessarily exist in a classroom or even through a traditional museum experience. So, and then there's two broad distinctions of categories that you can put historical games into. So immersion or simulation, or vicarious experience, or playing God. So immersion, I like to think of it as creating an emotional connection. You're, as the title suggests, like immersed in an experience. Jeremiah McCall argues that immersion is a representation, and representations most often created in the medium of textual narrative relay the events and causes in those events in a fixed linear fashion, which done in accordance to the standards of historical discipline correlates to the documentary evidence of the for the event or phenomenon in question. And then the historical accuracy as a standard is applied to representations, which means bearing a narrative or fixed illustration that is faithful to the experience. And I disagree with McCall there in terms of the value that can be found in immersion or representation, because this definition of the historical representation that uses to create a distinction from when he talks later about simulation does not factor in the role of empathy or how being a character, because you're kind of taking on the role of a character, even if they're technically separate from yourself, creates a unique connection that other means of historical representation do not. When you're reading a Outlander, say like historical fiction, you're not taking on the role of the protagonist. You're reading about it, but you're not actually making the choices that you get to in a video game. So immersion allows historical games to take an affective term. And by affective term, I mean, it's a recent shift in historical representation characterized by conjectural interpretations of the past, the collapsing temporalities and emphasis on affect rather than effect, and individual experience and daily life rather than historical events, structures, and processes. And so historical video games give players an immediate access to history. They're there, they're living it rather than seeing it as a neutral third party. They're not looking at something that's meant to be interpreted as objective. It becomes a subjective experience. And empathy in general is generally undervalued in academia, and games provide a unique opportunity to remind us that history is built on the stories we keep and share and human connection, which is something I think is often lost. So, games make us complicit in their worlds. So while the choices are pre-scripted and every outcome is accounted for, the player, by enacting those choices, takes on a unique role. They are an observer and a participant simultaneously. Again, that's not something you can get in many other traditional ways of engaging with heritage and history. So that brings us to simulating history. So simulation does not behave as representation. It models systems and processes that requires player input, and that input changes the outcome. So it's in conjunction with player interaction that leads to problems, choices, actions, and outcomes that are difficult to tie to affective meaning and storytelling. But simulation is still valuable, and that allows players to indulge in what-if scenarios. And that's something that's rather self-defeating in academia. We rely on what actually happened with the things that we have in front of us, and then drawing conclusions from there rather than talking about what could have been, because we have no way of knowing what could have been. But then when you have a simulation game and you have all your variables accounted for, that gives you an interesting time to try and figure out, well, what would this have looked like? What kind of variables would there have been engaged in there? And that's another valuable section of historical games. So another important thing to consider when talking about video games is intersecting barriers. In academia, there are still substantial issues of racism, colonialism, misogyny, and while we have different approaches for dealing with those things in academia, those problems manifest in different ways in video games. It's not, by no means a perfect medium, and for a very long time it was characterized as a hobby for straight white men. And there is still a perception that that's who it's for, especially with the big market games. That's who they market it towards. A lot of protagonists are men, they're white. Very rarely do you have a person of color or a woman. And so having public historians involved in the process of making games or developing their own provides more opportunities to tackle these issues in different ways, and intersecting and educating the public and getting them to think critically about history and representation that they haven't before. So some people might be aware of Gamergate that happened in 2013, or might be familiar with the notable backlash against games that, when big game titles that brought in people of color or women. And there tends to be when people talk about historical accuracy with video games, it's usually in response to something being portrayed that they don't like. So when Red Dead Redemption included black cowboys, there was a huge backlash, oh, black people weren't cowboys. that didn't happen. And then they had a whole little list of sources proving why Black men weren't cowboys, when in actuality, a lot of them were actually cowboys, especially free men from back after like the Civil War. And it was actually less white men, like most of the cowboys were actually men of color rather than white men. But that challenged the perception of Westerns that people had and thought that that was what history really was. Or when Battlefield 5 had women included in their story narratives as participants in World War II, that also had its own little slew of backlash. Yes, so we have games like Red Dead Redemption, who had a lot of representations of people of color and women in prominent roles, which was popular on one hand, but it still had that, that unique backlash that is more vitriolic than what we generally see in academia that needs to be accounted for. Battlefield 5. And then just to touch on briefly, can I get a job with all this? Video games are fun, but I still remember when I would play video games as a young teen, my mom said, "This is a useless hobby. What are you going to do with this?" And the joke's on her. I did make something out of it. I did my whole thesis on it. So there is a lot you can do with video games. For my thesis, I ended up making a game design document, which is basically the roadmap for designing and developing your own video game. I'm in the process of developing myself, but there are some challenges that come with it. When most people think of like, oh, I want to work on video games, they think of things like Ubisoft or Rockstar Games, like the big AAA game development industry. And it's extremely difficult and competitive to get into. And as you might have seen in the news with Blizzard Entertainment and their huge sexual harassment lawsuit in California happening, there is a lot of discrimination that happens in gaming companies that can make it very difficult to find an entry point in. So developing games independently is something that's very viable. There's a lot of game engines that are free that you can use at home. There's a lot of free coding programs available online. And if you want to create a public history oriented game and get it out in the world, self-publishing is the thing if you're okay with smaller distribution. Or something that I think is underutilized, especially with smaller museums and heritage sites, is the unwillingness to invest in projects such as like having a history-oriented game, especially if it was about histories in like smaller areas or rooted in stories that aren't usually told. I think it's worth investing in collaborating with multiple museum heritage institutions and seeing what you can do with it. The game I'm working on is focused on mining history in Northern Ontario and the women who lived there. And that's not something you see in a commercial game. That's also not something you usually see in indie games either. And I think it's an untapped market for things that people would find interesting and would actually want to invest in. But it's also difficult to try to get people to make a risk. So putting yourself out there, trying to get in contact with museums, universities, or heritage organizations is key. So definitely not like this is not an easy endeavor, but if it's something you're passionate about, I think it's something that's worth getting into. And then for funding, a lot of this, again, there's a lot of free resources, but there's been quite a few Kickstarter campaigns that were very lucrative. There's grants offered by the Canadian government for arts projects. And so having your goals set about what you want to do and how you're going to accomplish it, and getting out there and then trying to find people who want to work with you are the biggest things. So this was my little introduction to games as a way to engage with history and potential ways to broaden it, especially when it comes to heritage in smaller communities. So these are some of the sources I used, and just really good articles talking about history and video games, if anyone's interested. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jenna. That was really, really interesting. And I think an approach that many museums haven't necessarily considered, or maybe they don't even realize that there is that whole independent and smaller games and market that they can reach out to. So thank you. So next up is Sabrina Janke, who is a historian with a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Winnipeg. She has worked in heritage tourism since 2016, but got her start working in her hometown museum in 2012. Then along the way, she has developed and led numerous tours, worked as a historic consultant for TV, even appearing on CBC, and presently co-hosts the award-winning podcast One Great History, focusing on the history of Winnipeg. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Actually, I'm pretty sure, Matt, when I started with the exchange, you were still the person training the tour guides. I think you gave me my first tour of the area. So it's all come around full circle in a very interesting way.
Quite possible.
So yeah, I'm Sabrina Janke. I am a co-host and co-producer of One Great History. It's a Winnipeg-based history podcast. Presently, I'm also on the board of the Craft Museum, and I'm on a subcommittee with the Association for Manitoba Archives. So I've been involved in heritage for a number of years at this point and have been lucky enough to bounce around and meet different people and work in different industries. So I thought what today I would talk about is sort of the skills I picked up along the way and some of the observations I've had as a young person working in heritage. So I tend to work more in education and tourism as opposed to straightforward conservation. But heritage is one of those things that kind of overlaps with countless other industries. It's difficult to do tours in a neighborhood without historic buildings. They are a very physical and tangible connection to the past. It's also easier to talk about something like architecture when the architecture is physically present and not on a photo I'm holding in front of me. And heritage buildings tend to make up for really interesting sort of touristy neighborhoods. When you go to another city, you might visit like Toronto's Distillery District, Gastown in Vancouver, Old Montreal. And when you come to Winnipeg, you might visit the Exchange and the Forks. Those adaptive reuse projects can make for really vibrant sites for both locals and tourists alike. And even on like a less touristy scale, companies like Amazon and Google tend to move into industrial buildings to make up big office spaces. They've done that out in Hamilton Waterloo area pretty recently. And the aesthetic appeal of these old buildings also draws out film crews to Manitoba. It's that in the tax breaks. But it's why you see film crews using the Exchange District to do Hallmark movies and stuff like the Porter filming at the CPR station on Higgins and the Gabrielle Rom miniseries filming here in August. And there's countless other things. This brought in like $260 million a couple of years back. It's a huge industry. So the point of all of this is that heritage impacts all kinds of other points of sort of economy in the province. And there are theoretically countless ways to be involved in the industry. So I don't like have a hyper specific list of skills here. It's more sort of broader tips and tricks because theoretically you should be able to find a job, but there has to be jobs to look for in the first place. And there's really not right now. I promise I'm not trying to scare anyone off. I find working in heritage to be very valuable, but I do think it's important to be realistic about the industry you'd like to enter. And the reality is that there's not much in the way of funding for organizations to hire new employees. I'm talking more on the nonprofit side of things and sort of government departments. That is a whole different ballgame. But nonprofits are often funded through stuff like memberships, donations, grants, and government funding. And getting enough new memberships to cover the salary of a new employee would be a monumental task, leaving behind donations and grants, both of which will tend to go towards bigger projects and are less likely to go towards sort of back-end administrative stuff like keeping the internet or the lights on or hiring someone new. And government funding, as I'm sure many can attest, is incredibly difficult to obtain even on a good day. There are some grants available to hire students through Young Canada Works and Canada Summer Jobs, which sort of means that the only time organizations will get funding to hire is for several month terms in the summer, which means that there can potentially be really high rates of employee turnover as not every employee is going to come back. And even if a student comes back, they will eventually graduate. There is an internship program through Young Canada Works, but once you've done that, you are entering a field in which the majority of the jobs that exist are for students, which leaves you with a few options. You can go freelance and do contract work, leave the industry, or leave the province to find a job elsewhere. You can mix and match these options as you need. And there are some benefits to going freelance. You can dip your toes into all kinds of interesting things. It's how I got into consulting for the Gabrielle Rom miniseries, but it's a risky move without the privilege of some financial security, and you already need contacts in the industry to help you sort of navigate that world. A lot of the freelancing jobs I've had have been for people I've met through other jobs or volunteered with or met at other points in another. I don't have an easy answer for any of this. I can't as much as I might like to make people fund heritage projects more. But what I have is some skills that should help you succeed at any organization you might want to be a part of. The biggest one is probably one of the more obvious ones, and that is strong communication skills. It's going to show up on pretty much every job posting, but The reality is you are going to do a lot of writing in heritage, be it press releases, funding requests, reports, and even grant proposals, and knowing how to do those things and the language to use for each of those is invaluable. Some of this can be picked up as you go by reading previous funding reports and looking up stuff online. There are plenty of resources to help nonprofits navigate that. But locally, Creative Manitoba offers courses in grant writing, which I highly recommend if you're ever unsure how to get started on that. And there's more to this than just writing things out. Depending on the job you get, you might have to do public speaking. It's obviously a thing I do a lot of as a tour guide and a podcast host, but you may also wind up speaking at meetings, events, in front of city council, or at a heritage summit in front of many of your peers. And this is one of those things that you can only really get better at through practice. So the best tip I have for that is to get out and practice. I think I got better at public speaking because I did tours for 4 years. That really helps. So volunteer as a tour guide for Doors Open. Force yourself to public speak and engage with audiences and see what works and what doesn't for you. It's really helpful. Strong public speakers are definitely a huge asset in the industry. Now, obviously, with COVID going on, there's been less focus on in-person meetings and tours. It's more shifting online. So there is some benefit to also being familiar with social media. Most organizations today have at least one social media profile, if not several. And you don't need to be personally active on all of them, but at least an awareness of what each platform is and what it can be used for is beneficial. So for example, Facebook's demographic tends to skew older and it works better for sharing links and longer form posts. Whereas Instagram has a bit of a younger demographic, is for showing pictures, and you actually can't share links and text posts. So there's pros and cons to using both, and you have to sort of adapt to both of those. Twitter has a more varied demographic, but a much shorter word limit. So you have to be very efficient in the language you use. And the language you use on social media as an organization does also matter as well. When I'm doing stuff for One Great History, the tone is lighter, a little jokier, because the podcast tries to be a little lighter and jokier. But when I'm doing something for an actual organization, I try to be a little firmer, a little more professional. It's like a business casual approach to text would be maybe how I would describe it. And if you're unsure of what that might look like, you can look at other organizations in Winnipeg and across the country. And even moving behind the scenes, being able to understand social media analytics is super helpful. So this is stuff like what level of engagement your posts are getting. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter all allow you to sort of analyze that. And essentially what that is you can see how people have seen your post and have the group that have seen it, how many people have liked or commented or shared, and having that knowledge at your disposal is helpful should you ever have to apply for sponsorships or grants, depending on the scope of that project. Social media stuff is wide and varied and complicated, and at a lot of bigger organizations, it is a full-time job. But like Matt said, for heritage stuff, you're probably going to be wearing many different types of hats. So it's important to be flexible with what you are able and willing to do. And I think probably the biggest skill of all is just being flexible and knowing how to find stuff and troubleshoot problems and work your way around weird restrictions and loopholes, knowing where to find grants or how to troubleshoot the printer when it breaks. It's helpful. These are all kind of like softer skills. It's hard to put on a resume that you're really good at Googling problems, but have you ever worked for a place where you're the only one who can fix a tech issue, you realize how important it is and how worthwhile it is to develop. For me specifically too, knowing what historical resources are available is important. On my end, I like to manage that by making lists and little databases for myself to keep track of what's where and who to talk to when I need something. And it's nice to be able to whip that out of jobs. You're like, oh, well, I know who to go to for this problem or whatever else. But at the end of all of this, it's just being flexible and being patient. Finding work in heritage is incredibly difficult. It's something I'm doing because I'm really passionate about Winnipeg history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think that sharing it's important, even if it's not always easy. My biggest project, One Great History, is something that I do largely for free, despite it taking a lot of time and effort. And it's worth it by all accounts. But my big hope is that eventually we find a way to realize both the economic and social value of heritage. Thank you.
Just realized I was muted. Thank you very much. We do have a couple minutes, and there are a couple questions. One is asking, should we cater to new social media trends, like focusing on TikTok, or is there some tolerance amongst the post-secondary crowd to engage in other platforms? I see Twitter wars or threads that encourage people to show me your scariest doll for Halloween gaining traction.
Yeah, that's tough. I wouldn't say to jump into TikTok unless you're like really familiar to do that and manage it, especially because TikTok especially is video based. You need someone who is able to make videos and know what people want to like look at and engage with. But it's definitely a little easier to hop on board with like Twitter trends if there's something really interesting. Like if you were a museum with some scary looking dolls, share those. I think where it gets trickier is if you're trying to sort of shoehorn your organization into a trend that doesn't necessarily fit. I think it's better to wait for something that's relevant to you as opposed to trying to make social media trends fit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it definitely does. And there's another question asking, is there a dream task that you wish was included on a student position that people could add to their standard sort of tour guide museum summer student, sort of a dream task that you'd like to do?
Oh, that is a good question. I always really like being able to work at like bigger events and meet all kinds of people. So I'm always happier to do like things you get to go out and network, and those sort of opportunities are super valuable. When I was working as a tour guide downtown, I got to speak at like a Winnipeg Foundation event. I helped with some Heritage Winnipeg stuff. Being able to go out and make those connections is probably one of the better things to feature for jobs for students.
And one final one, and then we'll move on to our next presenters. Where can I advertise to youth and young adults? To put you on the spot here for that.
Yeah. It depends on who you're looking for. Instagram and Twitter tends to be a pretty good place, but reaching out to student groups would be really helpful if you're trying to get to like a university level crowd. I was the president of the History Association at the University of Winnipeg, and we would get like free tickets for movies and stuff, and we would always try and organize nights to get students together and engage in the community. So reach out to student groups and university departments would be probably the best place to start, especially if you're not sure who you're talking to on social media.
All right, thank you very much. Definitely a lot of conversation in the chat and the questions on the presentation.
Okay.
So our next panelist is Cheryl Mann, who is a Masters of City Planning candidate at the University of Manitoba and holds an honors degree in Bachelor of Arts from the University of Winnipeg, majoring in anthropology. She has interest in built heritage and is currently researching the issue of demolition by neglect. Having volunteered and worked in the heritage field, she's familiar with the challenges that young people face when pursuing a career in this area. So thank you, Cheryl.
Thanks for that introduction, Matt. So yeah, I'm here today to talk about some tips and advice that some young people who are dreaming of a career in heritage might find useful in achieving their goal. So there are many young people who are passionate about heritage and would like to make it their career, but as Sabrina mentioned, job opportunities are far and few between. So I would like to share some of the advice I have learned from my own experience and from wise career counselors, thoughtful colleagues, and generous mentors to help make the path to achieving a career in heritage a little bit smoother, regardless of where you are on that journey. I would also like to speak to professionals and how they might better support the youth in their pursuit of a career in heritage. It is so important to help nurture these young people today so they continue to stay in the field of heritage and are ready to step up and become leaders when their time comes. So if you're dreaming about a career in heritage, where do you start? My advice would be to try out the career you're interested in before you commit to pursuing it. It might not be possible in all cases, but if you can, certainly take advantage of every opportunity to do so. This might mean job shadowing, an internship, taking a course, or even volunteering. Whatever you can do to learn as much as possible about the career you're interested in. When starting out, we tend to have a romantic idea of what our career will be, that we will be out in the field every day, making great discoveries and changing the world. And while this enthusiasm and optimism is wonderful, the reality of a career might be really different, spending most of your time in an office doing paperwork, with change taking years to come to fruition. So make sure you are well informed about the career that you wish to pursue before you spend years and potentially tens of thousands of dollars pursuing it when you ultimately won't find it fulfilling. And if you discover that you don't really like the career you explored as much as you thought you would, remember that there are plenty of other careers in heritage to consider. Once you have landed on a career that you would like to pursue, I would suggest doing some research into the job market. How many people have this career today? Is it one person in all of Canada, or are there 100 people in just Winnipeg? Some people will feel more comfortable pursuing a job in a very competitive field with few opportunities, while others will want one that is more of a sure bet. Researching the job market might mean meeting with a knowledgeable career counselor, doing research on the internet, or even talking to someone in the field. Arm yourself with knowledge and make the decision that is right for you, so all your hard work will pay off in the end. And for the current heritage professionals, when a young person who is interested in a career in heritage comes to you looking for advice, please be generous with your knowledge and time. Be encouraging but realistic so they can pursue a career that is the best fit for them and will see them make great contributions in the field of heritage someday. So now that you've decided on what career you want to pursue, it is never too soon to start building your professional network. I would suggest you start by reaching out to someone who currently has your dream career. Send them an email, give them a call, introduce yourself, and explain that you are pursuing their career and who are looking for some advice. You would be surprised how receptive most people are to responding to such an inquiry out of the blue, as all people have advice to give, and most feel flattered when asked for it. So don't be shy, try reaching out. If you succeed in connecting with one person, use that as a jumping off point. Ask them if they know anyone else that it might be good for you to get in touch with. And don't forget to be gracious and leave a good impression. You never know if they might be your boss in the future. Volunteering in heritage, taking summer jobs in heritage, attending conferences like this one, and joining heritage organizations can all be great ways to build up your professional network. Take the time to get to know people, ask for business cards, sign up for email lists. So much of success in your career will be the result of being in the right place at the right time, knowing the right people. Some of the best jobs in heritage will never be posted publicly. And if you're not in the loop, you will never even know there was an opening. So do your best to make friends with the heritage community and show everyone what an excited, hardworking heritage enthusiast you are that they will want to hire someday. And again, to today's heritage professionals, please be welcoming to young people. They may not have the knowledge or experience yet, but they make up for it with energy, passion, and optimism. When they email you looking for advice, take the time to respond and point them in the direction of other resources. Welcome them into your organizations, introduce them to other heritage professionals, and give them opportunities to truly participate. Mentor them and guide them, and help them grow into tomorrow's heritage professionals. Education is another important aspect of pursuing your career in heritage. It can be time-consuming and costly, so I'd suggest you know what kind of education you need before starting your degree. The heritage professionals in your network are a great place to start learning about what kind of education you might need. Do you really need a PhD in history, or would a master's in business be more useful? Find out what kind of education other people have so you can make an informed decision. And if there's no specific degree you need, I would suggest considering a broad degree under which you can focus on heritage. So something like an architecture degree, but you can focus on historic architecture, or a business degree, and you can focus on nonprofits. You don't want to accidentally limit your opportunities in the future because you took an ultra-specific degree that is not applicable to most careers. Also, if possible, consider going to school in the city which you wish to eventually work in. Most of your professional network building will be done when you are in school through your professors, guest speakers, conferences, your classmates, and more. If you are going to school in Toronto and build your network there, it will be much harder when you come back to Winnipeg and try and start your career here with very limited connections. So if possible, make it easy for yourself and go to school in the city with which you wish to work. Sabrina has also touched on this, but along with your degree, take the time to invest in additional skills that will make you a more desirable candidate in a competitive job market. When everyone applying to a job already has a history degree, having a special certificate or diploma, knowing website administration, being adept on social media, having experience in graphic design, or knowing GIS might be the thing that sets you apart. So many heritage organizations are very small, with one person filling many roles. When considering who to hire, it is often these additional skills that someone has that makes them the most desirable candidate, because they can do all the tasks position requires. The ones that are related to heritage and the ones that are just related to running a successful organization. And for today's heritage professionals, please give thoughtful advice to young people about what kind of education they might pursue. What kind of things are you looking for when you're hiring? A specific degree or a collection of skills and experience? Let's guide young people so they can start their career with a toolkit full of useful certification and skills that will make them desirable to any employer. Once you have finished your education and are ready to start applying for jobs, I would suggest you start by reaching out to your network. Let people know you are looking for work. Have they heard of any opportunities? Or maybe they have suggestions on where to look for work. Make use of those connections you have made. I would also advise you to work on your resume writing skills and take the time to tailor each resume to a specific job application. If a job posting asks for specific skills, the first thing your resume should be doing is describing how you have those specific skills. Employers don't want to take time to go on a scavenger hunt through your resume and try and figure out if you have the specific skills they are looking for. Make it easy for them. Start with your qualifications for the job, followed by the relevant skills you have. And be sure to give examples of how you have those skills, not just stating that you have them. Keep your resume short and to the point. You only have a brief opportunity to make a good impression. And as you hunt for jobs, don't be discouraged when every posting you see is asking for several years' experience, even though it's an entry-level position. You have the experience. The volunteering, summer jobs, internships, even your time at school, that's your experience. When taken together, you will often have the skills they are looking for. You just need to think creatively. Don't undersell yourself when you have worked hard and you are a great candidate. Also considering preparing a portfolio to go with your resume. This is a great way to show off exceptional projects you have taken part in, display your strengths and skills that are more subjective, and provide more personal insight into who you are. Your portfolio might start out with a personal statement about why you're passionate about the field you are pursuing, followed by a CV with your qualifications. Consider adding assignments you did from school or projects from your summer job, things that show the breadth and quality of your skills. And make sure it is not too long or too wordy. A few paragraphs from a great paper you wrote is plenty. Don't include the whole essay. A portfolio can set you apart when submitting a job application and is great to bring to a job interview, especially when multiple people are interviewing you. Be sure you're putting your best foot forward and the materials you choose represent you. Whether you're writing a resume or portfolio, be sure that you are following the job application instructions to the letter. You don't want to get disqualified from a wonderful opportunity because you made a silly mistake like addressing your cover letter to the wrong person. Pay attention to details so you are seen as the optimum candidate. Finally, be open to opportunities when you are looking for jobs. Your dream career might not be within reach right away, but there are other jobs that might act as stepping stones to it or lead you down a completely different path that you might find you like even more. Keep an open mind and don't turn things down just because they aren't perfect. Careers in heritage are far and few between, so make a point of taking advantage of every opportunity that comes your way. And finally, one last word to today's heritage professionals. Please take that risk and hire a young person. They desperately need someone to have faith in them and give them the opportunity to work in heritage. They might not have the most experience, but they really need the chance to gain some. Embrace their eagerness, let them try out new ideas, and be gracious when they make mistakes. We were all lucky enough to have someone who was willing to take a risk and hire us once, and it is now time for us to return the favor. Nurturing today's youth is so important in the heritage field. We want the best and brightest to pursue heritage careers so they can contribute great things in the future. If we do not give them the support and real opportunities today, I mean more than an 8-week summer job, they will leave the field of heritage to a different job where they can actually find sustainable employment. We need to take action and start mentoring young people today, because once everyone is retired, it is too late, and all the years we have put into preserving our heritage will be lost to history. Thank you so much for listening, and good luck to everyone pursuing a career in heritage.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Do have a couple questions for you. One is also the same as, is there an innovative task that you would like to be to be given as a summer student?
I don't think there's any specific task that comes to mind, but allowing students to do, I want to say, serious work. It's easy to give summer students kind of fluffy jobs, like I need this filing done, sign this poster, but that's not really the experience they need. They need to go through how you write a grant. They need to sit in on a meeting. They need to be involved, which is often probably more work for the organization than a benefit, but we need to put that investment in students so that they can gain those skills and be ready when it's their turn to be hired.
Right. And along with that, you mentioned with highlighting different skills, someone's asking from the employer's point of view, what skill sets do they think that they should be asking for that you seldom sort of see?
Oh gosh. That's a tough one. I think it's probably boring administrative skills that we need the most and that we forget to ask about. You know, we're on top of asking like, oh, do you know how to use social media? Because that seems really important, but we forget to ask like simple things like, do you know how to address an envelope? Because those are things lots of heritage organizations are doing, but we see young people coming in without those skills. So just some really basic office skills that everybody needs that we forget that are important because we get caught up in the big fancy skills.
Right, thank you very much. In the interest of time, we're going to have to move on to our next speaker. If we do have a little bit of time at the end, we can look at some questions again. Our final speaker today is Bailey Palamar, who is a recent graduate of the University of Manitoba with an honors degree in anthropology, currently working at the St. Boniface Museum. She's preparing to publish a paper exploring Belgian-Canadian artist Armand Lemai's his art and his homestand in Manitoba through an archaeological perspective. And she's planning to pursue graduate studies in archaeology with the goal of becoming a museum curator. So thank you, Bailey.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I will just share my screen here. I have prepared a little PowerPoint to go along with my presentation today. So as Matthew was saying, my name is Bailey Palamar, and I will be talking about my experience in heritage. Okay, having a bit of difficulty here showing my PowerPoint. I'll just do it like this. This will be fine. So I've been interested in heritage for a very long time. Since I was a small child, I have absolutely loved museums, and that has never changed. And still, even today, I can spend hours in them. I have also loved history and reading historical fiction books for a long time. And these are activities where my interest in heritage initially began. And these interests and my interests in heritage have remained constant. So I was first exposed to anthropology specifically 9 years ago when I was in grade 9 during a career discovery session. And we were doing this career quiz, and anthropologist popped up as a good match for me. I found it very vast and very deep, and I remember being very intrigued by it. However, very strangely, I did not think that would be something I would pursue at the time, and now here we are. I have a degree in anthropology. I had been involved in the heritage world in an informal sense for quite a while, but I took my time to enter the heritage world in a formal sense. I started my bachelor's degree in 2016, and in my second year in 2017, I declared a psychology degree, as I thought I wanted to become a psychologist. And even from the moment I made that decision, it didn't feel right to me. And now that I think of it, everything I did outside of my university courses pointed to heritage. I went to cultural festivals and museums in my free time. I was still reading a lot of historical fiction books, and I had been volunteering at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights for the past year. And in fact, earlier in 2017, I had even started a new job at the St. Boniface Museum. So everything I was doing outside of university was heritage related, and I was very unhappy in my psychology degree. And an academic advisor gave me the best advice ever. She told me to take only courses that I love. So I did that. I took my introductory anthropology and archaeology courses. I was captivated and I changed my whole degree to one in anthropology. So heritage was right there the whole time. I just had to listen and pay attention. So I didn't give archaeology specifically much thought until I changed my degree to one in anthropology. It really had the time depth I was missing from other parts of anthropology. And not only does archaeology study past people, but it studies past people through their things, which is a very unique approach to understanding people. And I initially did not think I would be a good fit in archaeology because I'm more of an artsy person. And I did find the super scientific parts of archaeology kind of unwieldy. However, in my archaeology courses at the University of Manitoba and in my field school at Brandon University, I learned that there's many approaches and methods to archaeology and that I don't need to become a specialist in a super scientific part of archaeology. And archaeology is more of a recent finding for me. So now I'm trying to broaden my involvement in that area. The pandemic, unfortunately, has made and continues to make this much harder. For instance, I am unable to volunteer in the archaeology lab at the University of Manitoba due to pandemic restrictions. Also, archaeological field schools often get cancelled or I am unable to attend them due to travel restrictions. Earlier this year, in May and June, I was finally able to do a field school with Brandon University. And there I was able to experience archaeology in a practical sense for the first time, which allowed me to gain a better understanding of it. Also this summer, I was very fortunate in that I was able to volunteer on a dig with Public Archaeology Days. And as Matthew mentioned, I'm working on getting a paper I wrote in archaeology published. So this is a gap year for me. So right now I'm working on gaining as much practical experience in heritage as possible. And having this degree opens up more possibilities. There are opportunities for recent grads. They do exist. There are some, but I am concerned that the pandemic is cutting down on that. And in the future, I will be furthering my education with a master's degree in archaeology because I love it. And it will help me reach my goal of becoming a museum curator. I believe I will be able to find work in the heritage sector, although I know there will be many challenges to get there. I am relieved that there are government grants that are given to heritage organizations. That is helpful. There needs to be more of them though. And it is unfortunate and sad that heritage is not always seen as valuable or lucrative or important by governments and the general public. So it's not the most well supported financially because it's not a priority. And now with the pandemic, I don't see heritage becoming more of a priority in the near future. For employment so far, I am very, very lucky that it is currently working out pretty well for me. I had a full-time job this summer doing collections work at the St. Boniface Museum, and that has been extended for a few months. I'm very fortunate that that worked out. And there's also a possibility of me working for an archaeological cultural resource management company this spring or summer. So there are roadblocks that youth face when it comes to getting involved in heritage. And when I was a student not too long ago, the biggest roadblock I faced by far was time. It's very difficult to maintain a full-time course load or even a part-time one when you're doing higher level courses. It's hard to do all that, plus fulfill household responsibilities, have somewhat of a social life, work part-time, get enough sleep, and be on a continuous lookout for heritage opportunities. And fortunately, these days, I do have a bit more free time now that I'm not a student, but time will become more of an obstacle once again when I go to grad school. And another massive roadblock that affects youth, but also affects everyone is the pandemic. And some of the consequences of the pandemic have included many canceled opportunities. And unfortunately, this roadblock is still persisting for the time being, regardless of whether you are a student or not, or a young person or not. However, fortunately, there are strategies to overcome these roadblocks as much as possible. And for me personally, I have found good time management to be essential. And part of that is establishing priorities. And for me, that includes talking to heritage practitioners, such as getting involved with the Career Mentor Program at the University of Manitoba, to talk to heritage practitioners and also connecting with them through people I know. And the pandemic is a much harder roadblock to contend with, but with that, I try to be very persistent, and I try for many opportunities because something will work out eventually. And there are many ways to help us, to help youth become more involved in heritage. Something that is crucial, and many speakers have touched on this today, is continued and improved funding. And that's also for youth, student, and recent graduate positions. And this is crucial because it allows us to gain valuable experience in heritage and allows us to have stable employment in the heritage sector. Also, communication is always essential, and improved communication from heritage organizations would really be useful. Especially when it comes to volunteering. It's very time consuming and very challenging to make sure all information is up to date and to make sure that it's easily accessible across all platforms. But it's so important to do this so anyone who wants to get involved in heritage has clear indications of where to start. Word of mouth is also amazingly effective. So enhancing heritage's exposure on the ground game, such as attending career events, hosting public events. Already there's many wonderful examples of this. And even starting at a young age by going into schools are some other ideas to help youth become more involved in heritage. Also, we youth, we need to ensure that we are reaching out to people and to organizations to show our interest. It's crucial for the transmission of knowledge and also for building good relationships with heritage communities and their people. I have met many great people and I have received so much valuable advice from doing that. And I even hear about most heritage opportunities, whether that be educational or work or volunteering, through other people, through talking to people. And in my experience, people love to talk with you, they love to get to know you, and they are very happy to get you acquainted with the heritage world. By both heritage organizations and youth meeting each other halfway with communication, we can help youth become more involved in heritage. Thank you very much for listening today. And yes, back to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Bailey, for your presentation. We just have about a minute left. So one question I'll put to you that was asked is, what area of curation are you most interested in sort of pursuing in post-secondary or work experience?
Okay, yes. So what I personally am more interested in pursuing, I tend to gravitate towards more recent history. I really like the last 200-ish years. So that's an area I'm interested in pursuing. But I also do have an interest in material culture. So that's why I would like to do a master's in archaeology. So that's what I'm interested in specifically. But I do like exploring other areas as well, because there most certainly is a lot of history, and it's really great to learn about it.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much to all our panelists. I think there's been lots of comments in the chat, lots of questions. To get some people really thinking that there are youth that are very passionate about heritage, and that there are a lot of challenges both for the youth to find employment, but also for the museums and employers to sometimes find that funding to bring them in. So I think we definitely were able to give some hints, and clearly it's still an issue, and I think unfortunately is still going to be sort of an ongoing issue of how we can bring the two together. But hopefully presentations like this help. So again, thank you all for taking part, and I'll turn it back over to our MC.